This is Chuck Sachs for Indie Opera Podcast, and I'll be talking with Will Crutchfield, who has reconstructed Florestan's Lost Aria from Beethoven's 1805 version of the opera Léonore. Léonore will be performed by Ryan Brown at Opera Lafayette on February 26th in D.C. and on Monday, March 2nd, 7 p.m. at the K Playhouse at Hunter College, New York. Hello, how are you doing today, Will?
Doing just fine, thanks.
How did you get involved with this production of Léonore?
Well, I got involved through a board member of Opera Lafayette who heard a reconstruction I had done of a missing movement of a Donizetti symphony. And he liked it and asked, would I dare to try Beethoven? And so, of course, my first answer was, let me look at the material. Let me see if I think I would be attempting something foolish. But of course, then I got to know about their project, and which I think was not even yet announced at the time. Their perspective has to do with the relation of their French opera specialty to the origins of Fidelio to begin with. Mm-hmm. I should clarify, Léonore, Fidelio. We call the early ones Léonore. Mm-hmm. Actually, the first version was called Fidelio, then the second version was called Léonore, and then the third version was called Fidelio again. So it's totally confusing. And to keep it simple, we call the earlier one Léonore.
Okay.
And that was the title of a French opera by Gaveaux, which Opera Lafayette has done. So, and French opera was hugely important to German opera at that time. And Beethoven's librettist basically translated, with some changes, but basically translated the French libretto into German verse, and that is the main point of contact for Opera Lafayette. But then it comes with this little problem.
Right. It's the missing aria and scene, mostly, for Florestan, who doesn't show up till Act 3.
That's right, because he's the prisoner who is being rescued.
Right, the prisoner of state.
Yes, and the problem is this. They could perfectly well have done the score that everybody else has done of Léonore, but this tenor aria always has to be done in the version from the following year, because it got cut up when Beethoven had to shorten and simplify the opera. Most of the pieces from the first version survive, but this particular one got physically cut up because they were going to keep part of it.
Why was there so much cut and reworking of this piece?
It had a very mixed success, and some people around Beethoven were convinced that he had made too difficult demands on the concentration of the audience, that he needed to simplify it and shorten it. And maybe in some cases you could say they were right, but maybe they were just like show doctors panicking because the audience was fidgety or something. And it didn't really get a fair test on the first try because Vienna was under attack by the French, and the core audience went off to their summer houses if they could, and so it was kind of a mess, the premiere of the opera. And the cuts he made were not necessarily fully thought through. And in the case of this aria, I mean, I have seen before the first version. As far as I knew, it was the first version. I didn't know at that time that this tenor aria had a complicated situation. But I always thought the tenor aria was a little lame, because what happens is he sings this beautiful aria of sort of noble resignation about his fate, and then he moves into this somewhat anxious section, hoping that Léonore is okay up there, out in the world.
Yes.
He has no communication with her, and hoping that she will realize he did the right thing by telling the truth and getting himself imprisoned. But it's sort of...
And in this case, the right thing was speaking out against Pizarro.
Yes.
And his bad behaviors, bad acting.
Yes. And so, if you spoke out against a leader, you could get punished for it. Not that anything like that happens today, but just suppose in fiction that it might happen. And the problem with the aria in that version is that it goes from a beautiful slow movement to a faster movement, but that faster movement has a kind of a downer character.
Okay.
And there's nothing else. And what jumped out at me when I started studying the sketches, the part he cut out between version 1 and version 2 has this ecstatic recollection of happy days in the past with Léonore. A flute solo comes in that was completely lost, and the music takes on a kind of excitement, almost jubilation, as he gazes on her portrait and thinks of the moments of their young love. And that's what got lost. So after I studied those sketches, I thought, yes, this scene needs something to show Beethoven's original idea.
So this version had bad word of mouth. So
we don't even know that.
It's barely been done. Am I correct?
What we are doing has never been done.
Okay. And then, of course, it had that big hole in it in the beginning of Act 3, this aria and scene.
Well, here's the trouble. The scene was still there.
Okay.
It's just the middle of it was cut out.
Okay.
And generally speaking, people didn't know that it was ever there. Beethoven scholars knew because they have studied the sketches, and so there was a lot for me to read about it. People have gone through these sketches. The other trouble, though, is the sketches are just, almost all of them, are just the top line. Beethoven was trusting to his memory how he was going to fill in the harmony, how he was going to have the bass line. I mean, we do have a complete top line.
So the melody that he's singing.
Yeah, the melody that he's singing or the melody that the flute is playing, because there's a flute solo.
Yes.
So you have a sort of a continuous draft that either it's the flute or it's Florestan, or a little later it's the clarinet. But there's a lot left, and so I don't really call it a reconstruction. It's more of a hypothetical composition under the part that comes from Beethoven, and that's a little bit rash to I have to invent all the harmony and counterpoint and so on, but I thought it was worth taking the risk because the heart of the scene is there.
But it also, I expect, comes from long study of Beethoven's style and harmonic structures and
yes,
what was used
course.
in the rest of the opera.
Of course. I mean, all of us who study music closely get an idea of, okay, this sounds like Beethoven and this doesn't.
Right.
And I think the reason I got tapped for the project is that I have done this a lot with the composers that my opera company usually performs, which is Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini. It's not so unusual that if you're reviving an opera that didn't go into the repertory, there can be gaps.
Yes.
There can be gaps. Things can get lost. It was all on paper. If it went into the repertory like the Barber of Seville, then there are 1 million copies out there, and you can find what you need. But if it didn't go in the repertory, either because for some reason the opera was not a success at the beginning, or because it got revised, like this one, then that first version, there's not so many copies of it, and all it takes is 1 or 2 getting lost or torn up, and you're out of luck. The piece existed. Beethoven finished it. We know he wrote it. We can even see the first page of a part of it because they didn't throw it out. But so we know it was there. But there is no way to give it to the theater goer unless you fill in the blanks. And so that's what I've done.
I mean, and also luckily, you knew the orchestration of the opera as set, so there are a lot of guidelines there, but it's still not unlike, I guess, the end of Turandot, and
we have a little more to go on than he.
And was it Lulu?
Lulu was pretty complete. It's just that the orchestration was not complete, but there was much less for Turandot than what I had to work with, but much more for Lulu than what I had to work with.
Okay.
So if you have the top line and you have the words and how the voice did the words, you know the shape. You know the blanks you've got to fill in. It's just that that's quite a lot of blanks.
So does this lead to then possibly a new critical edition of this score version?
No, I don't think so. I think it's too speculative for a critical edition. What it could be is that when they get around to a critical edition of this early version of Fidelio, again, there is one already, but it's 50 years old and standards have changed. I think when they make another one, what they will probably need to do is print the entire melodic line from the sketches, or a selection, because there are alternative sketches, so that people can see what we know was there in the version of it that survives, which is the sketched version.
Right.
In a critical edition, you don't usually put in what somebody else has reconstructed unless it is much smaller. Like, I did a critical edition for the Rossini Foundation, where there were a couple of places where like 2 bars were missing because a copyist back in the day turned 2 pages at once, that kind of thing.
That was Aureliano in Palmyra?
Yes, correct. And if it's a matter of filling in a few bars in the middle of an ongoing passage, then yes, you can put that in a critical edition. But if it comes to making stuff up for a 4-minute segment, which is what I've done here, that is not the kind of thing you usually put in a critical edition. However, we'll find out. If it sounds good, then maybe people will want to use it. Who knows? All that's on our minds right now is doing this initial presentation of it.
So when creating this, do you have the melody, and do you then create a piano accompanied version first, or are you jiving right into the orchestration?
I went in more straight into the orchestration, but the real question is, what is the bass line and what is the harmonic progression?
Yes.
And so I started just by filling in. Well, first of all, I had to study all the sketches and choose which version of the melodic line, because sometimes there are 5 or 6 versions. And I would say in most parts of this aria, it is clear what is the most recent version in the sketchbook. Not always, but in most of it. So I usually picked that. Sometimes there is something so unclear in the sketch that you want to look at an earlier sketch and say, that's what he was working from, so maybe he meant this. They're very hard to read. He was not careful about aiming his pencil precisely, because he was only writing for his own eyes. He could remember what he meant. And so the first thing I did was just fill that in at the top of some orchestra paper, and then the bass line. And there are hints for that, There's something that he did quite a lot right at the beginning of the slow aria. He has, this is technical for a second, but he has the 3rd degree of the scale resolving down to the 2nd over a bass that is the raised 4th degree. It's a certain chromatic bass. It suggests what we call a secondary dominant for a moment, but it's a very particular move, and it happens right at the beginning of the slow aria. And so I saw several places in the part that I needed to make up where a pattern like that is happening in the melody. So first thing you do is, okay, he had this raised 4th degree on his mind in the bass, let's try that, and in this case that worked well, and I kept it. And so you build up from little hints like that. There's another place where the melody does something that it then does again in the anxious part at the end, where he's saying he hopes that Léonore realizes he did the right thing. Part of that melody comes back. And when it comes back, there's a certain pattern of violin arpeggios in the orchestra. So it's a different key, it's minor instead of major, etc. But look at that and you think, okay, he had in his mind that this melody goes with these arpeggios. Let's try them. You know? And bit by bit, you fill in as much as you can from hints. And then what's left after the hints, which is still a lot, you just have to compose.
Wow. I guess the closest I've come to that, because I've worked with a lot of composers myself, and frequently with lead sheets. And I kindly call them songsmiths, because they're not doing the rest of the work. And my goal has always been to follow what their intent is and their style without imposing. And it's a lot of work, because you're creating that accompaniment,
that's right,
and the whole style and flair of that.
Well, the whole era of continuo in classical music is exactly that. The composer's ideas are the basis, but there's a lot left for the performer to fill in when you have basso continuo. And this is kind of like soprano continuo.
Yes.
Meaning you don't have that bass line.
Right.
But yeah, you just have to build it up from there. And if you are an experienced continuo player, and if you have properly studied harmony and composition, then it's not like you're guessing in the dark. The question is just, can you come up with something that actually sounds a little like Beethoven?
Right. Because
if not, it's not worth trying.
Yes. Well, I'm excited to see it and hear this work, and I'm so glad to hear that it has been done, so that we can fully hear Leonore in its some kind of completed version.
I think it's worth doing. I think that it changes a crucial point in the opera. When we first meet this guy who is the whole reason the opera exists,
yes,
we might as well hear as close as we can to the full thoughts Beethoven had. And I do think that when he cut down, sometimes he cut too much, or sometimes he cut hastily when if he had time to really rewrite, he might have come up with a shorter version of the opera, but without just throwing out chunks. And of course, that's what he then did in 1814 when he wrote the Fidelio we know. In this case, he wrote an entirely new fast movement for this aria, and it's a masterpiece. But still, it's beautiful to hear the first idea he had, and I now believe necessary to get the right proportion and feeling for who this guy is down there in the dungeon, thinking about his Léonore, whom we have been watching upstairs in the prison, being so brave.
So, thank you for sitting with me. I'm just wondering, what is next for you?
Next for me is getting back to work on the Teatro Nuovo season for summer 2020. We have two very exciting Rossini pieces. One of them is an American premiere, and one of them is an opera, one of those operas that everybody knows it exists, but attempts to perform it are rare because it's so hard. That's Maometto Secondo. And the one that is the American premiere is Il Vero Omaggio, which is, right, nobody, the look on your face is on everybody's face. It is called a scenic cantata, but it is written for action sets and characters. It's a kind of a mini opera, and it was written to entertain the Congress of Verona. That was the fifth and last Congress of the Holy Alliance. This is a piece actually commissioned by Metternich.
Wow.
To entertain the assembled diplomats of the world after a hard day's politics. And it's a brilliant piece. It's the last thing he wrote just before Semiramide. So it's prime Rossini at his most inventive, and we're very excited to be doing it.
Well, this sounds exciting, and I hope to sit down and talk with you more about those.
Pleasure.
So, thank you. Thank you for listening to Indie Opera Podcasts, and watch out in March for my interview with Jean-Michel Richer, the rising young tenor who is singing Florestan in this production of Léonore.